Hi, everybody. This is Mark Brower, and I'm here with a short video. I'm actually going live to talk about the difference between seeing addiction as a black and white category. You either are addicted or you're not, as opposed to viewing it as a spectrum. And just like we've learned about and we talk about autism as a spectrum, I think it's more helpful to think of addiction as a spectrum. And this can apply to all kinds of addictions and compulsive behaviors. I'm going to be talking especially about sexual addiction. That's been my background, and I used to teach workshops with Mark Laser some years ago, and it was focused on sexual addiction. And we would have a lecture about this very topic because people would pay large amounts of money to come to this. It's like a 3-day intensive workshop for people dealing with sex addiction. And because of the negative stereotypes around it and sort of the stigma attached to it, people would spend a lot of time in this seminar trying to figure out if they're really addicts or not. In other words, trying to look at all the behaviors and compare themselves to everyone else in the room, and to try to find some sort of loophole because they didn't want to adopt that label for themselves. And we just found that let's just get rid of the label and think of this as a spectrum where on the one side, you might think of, I use the term self-mastery here, just self-control, that you're in control of your habit, whatever it might be, whatever the struggle might be with sexual temptation, sexual activity, maybe it's porn use, that's an option or a temptation for you, but it's really under control. But then you start to move further and further along where it starts to feel more out of control, or maybe a better way to say it would be that you find yourself succumbing to that behavior periodically. And over here, I might think of this, or I might use the term struggle. It's a struggle in my life. I don't know that I necessarily meet the diagnostic criteria for addiction or not, but it's a struggle. And then over further and further, it becomes something that feels more and more out of control. And you're like, okay, this is an addiction in my life. And so I would often, and still do to this day, talk in terms of a sexual struggle, the different struggles that we have controlling our behaviors, just like with food, or maybe for some people, alcohol use, that so there might be a way that you can have a healthy relationship to it, but then it starts to become more and more out of control, and then we could just say it's an addiction. So how do we think about sex as an addiction, or if you want to say I'm further over on this spectrum, how would I know? And so here, let's look at what the DSM, which is the handbook that's used by therapists and insurance companies to determine mental disorders, right? And to use that to diagnose mental disorders. This is what they say about substance use disorders. Okay, so this is how they would describe addiction. And what they do is, for many of the disorders or the psychological issues that they talk about, they will create lists. And in this case, it's a list of 11 criteria. And then the idea is you work with someone, or you analyze yourself and see which of these criteria do I identify with. And usually there's might be several of them. And the idea with the DSM is if you meet X number of the following criteria, then you can be diagnosed with that disorder. So here it is with addiction, or rather what they would call substance use disorder. The term addiction doesn't show up here. And once again, this is applying to substance use, but we could apply it to behaviors as well. And I'm moving it closer so you can see it. So the first criteria would be hazardous use, that you engage in this activity even though it might get you in trouble, or you realize it's maybe bad for you, but you still do it. Number two, social interpersonal problems, that doing this creates problems in your relationships. Number three, kind of related to that by when you use this, or your use of this causes you to neglect, like let's say you're parenting, you're doing this instead of parenting, or it's getting in the way of your parenting or other relationships or responsibilities that you have. Maybe like, let's say with pornography use, someone might be using pornography when they're supposed to be working, that sort of thing. Number 4 and 5 are clear with substance use and maybe less clear with behaviors, but this is a big deal. One would be withdrawal. That's the fourth criteria. That is when you stop using something or stop doing something, you feel bad. There are physical withdrawal symptoms. Once again, when it comes to sexual behaviors, some people identify with that, some people don't. But the number 5 is tolerance, and that is that it takes more of the thing for you to get the same effect. With alcohol use, it's more stronger alcohol to get the same buzz. And then with, let's say, pornography or other sexual activity, it's more of it, or it's more intense, sort of further out there kinds of behaviors or kinds of pornography, that it takes that in order to be turned on. So that's how tolerance works. It's about neurochemistry and how the brain adjusts. But that's a really important and helpful way to recognize that this is getting out of control, because it's requiring more or more intense forms for it to have the same effect on me. That's tolerance. Number 6, using larger amounts or using it for longer. Again, this is really kind of a flip side of tolerance. They're very, very closely related, but you do more of it. Takes more and more of your time. Number 7, you have tried to stop or tried to limit and been unable to. You keep coming back even though you've said, I'm going to stop this. That's number 7. Number 8, spent a lot of time using whatever that is. So, inordinate amount of time, or more time than you would like to be spending doing that. Number 9, physical or psychological problems emerging because of what you've been doing. And number 10, activities given up for use. In other words, you stop doing other things that you maybe liked doing because you don't have time, or because you're just focusing so much on this, it's keeping you from other stuff, right? Okay, and then finally, feeling of craving. When you're not using, you think about it, you crave it. All right, so these are the 11 criteria for substance abuse, and we could use these same criteria for other things, other habits, practices, gambling, various kinds of sexual things, food. So when you look at that list, can you identify with any of these criteria? So I'm going to shift the page once more and show you another way of looking at this. So this is how they would then invite you to diagnose whether you have this disorder or not. All right, I'm having a hard time holding my papers. All right, so the way that the DSM would categorize this is they would say that if you have 2 or more of these criteria in a 12-month period, then you would qualify, or you could be diagnosed as having a substance abuse disorder. And once again, then, if you think about these applied to sexual behavior, those 11 criteria I just pointed out, if you noticed or experienced 2 or more of those within the last 12 months, then you could be identified or diagnosed as having a use disorder. 2 to 3 of these would be a mild disorder. 4 to 5 would be a moderate substance abuse disorder, and having 6 or more of those you could be diagnosed as having a severe disorder. So once again, I'm going to go back to this first chart that I put together and held out for you. Most of us are somewhere on this spectrum where we recognize there are things, again, now with regard to sexuality, given our world has so many there's so much material out there that is easily accessible, and so we may have to make decisions and choices about staying away from it. And some of us are in a great place with that self-mastery around these behaviors, and then others of us are going further and further along in that struggle or in this spectrum towards addiction. Where are you in that category? I am putting together a program, or I have put together, or we're getting ready to launch it, called the Renewed Man program. It's a 12-week boot camp. And this program is for people who find themselves at various places along this spectrum of struggle. People who are very far along in the struggle, we have a level 2 version of the program. But for a lot of people who are kind of in the middle here, there's some great help that we can offer. So I hope that whether it's the Renewed Man program or some other program or strategy, habits, practices that you engage in, you're able to do that so that this challenge does not become a huge problem, does not become a disorder, does not become an addiction for you. All right, have a great week.